Every country on earth is in debt. This sentence is the greatest, most normalized, and least questioned truth of the modern age. When you turn on the television or read the news, you constantly hear those numbers. The United States now stands on the edge of a $38 trillion debt abyss. Japan, the world's technology giant, owes $9 trillion. Germany, the engine of Europe, industrial powerhouses, developing nations, all of them are buried in debt. No matter where you point the map, you are confronted with a boundless ocean of staggering figures. The total debt of the entire planet has now reached $315 trillion. That is 3 times the total value produced by the global economy, by all of humanity, 7.5 billion people, working non-stop for an entire year. But what should truly terrify you is not the unpronounceable size of these numbers. What should keep you awake at night is the simple yet devastating paradox at the very heart of the system. If everyone in the world is in debt, then who exactly is owed this money? If every government, every corporation, and every individual owes something to someone, who sits at the very top of this colossal list of creditors? The answer is far different and far more unsettling than you might expect. Because when you patiently follow the chain of creditors all the way to the top, when you trace who actually holds that money, you come face to face with an uncomfortable truth. The world is not in debt to a single individual, a secret cult, or some distant hidden power. The world is, in fact, in debt to itself. But this is not a byproduct of economic evolution, not an accident, and not an uncontrollable misfortune. This was designed exactly this way, deliberately, meticulously, and step by step, by the hands of 4 different men over the span of 3 centuries. For banker figures who inscribed their names into the dusty pages of history under different roles. They built a system in which debt could never be fully repaid, in which governments would be forced to borrow forever just to survive, and in which the interest earned through the sweat of the people would flow endlessly like a river from the lowest layers of society to a small handful of names at the very top. What I'm describing is not a conspiracy theory, not speculation, and not an urban legend. This is a documented history, sealed with wet signatures and recorded deep within state archives. Those secret meetings held behind closed doors in dimly lit rooms, the contracts that were signed and the massive mechanisms that were set in motion, still exist today in public records. That is why $38 trillion is no longer a problem waiting to be solved. If you see this figure as a problem, then you still don't understand the system. On the contrary, that enormous debt is the greatest proof that the gears set in motion centuries ago are working with flawless efficiency, exactly as designed. $38 trillion is not a crisis. It is a business model. In this video, we will show how this debt trap was turned into a product of financial engineering, the 4 critical turning points that irreversibly altered the course of history, and why every government on Earth today is trapped inside this massive labyrinth with no exit. To understand the invisible chains of the modern world, why the money in your pocket loses value every single day, and why your future has already been mortgaged, we must return to the very point where it all began, to that first day when the nature of money was changed forever, and kings knelt before bankers. Before 1694, the world operated with a level of honesty and tangible logic around debt that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. If you were a king and needed money, you had 2 options. You either spent the gold you already possessed and, as it ran out, collected more taxes from your subjects, or you knocked on the doors of wealthy gold merchants and borrowed from them personally. This debt relationship was a double-edged sword. Debt was personal, and most importantly, it was temporary. If a king failed to repay his debt, he would default, creditors would lose their money, the system would collapse in some way, but ultimately it would clean up its own mess and begin again. Debt had an endpoint. It was either repaid or erased. The system had an exit door, until a Scottish financial schemer named William Paterson introduced a darker idea. Paterson was an ambitious but unsuccessful man who went bankrupt multiple times while trying to get rich. His real talent, however, was not trade, it was identifying the weak point in the nature of money itself. When he put his plan on paper in 1691, England was on the brink of catastrophe. The never-ending 9 Years' War against King Louis XIV of France had completely drained the English treasury. King William III had no gold left to feed his army, not a single pound to keep his navy afloat. Worse still, the English crown had such a terrible track record of repaying its debts that traditional lenders had already shut their doors in the king's face. It was at this exact moment of desperation that Paterson appeared before the king and offered him the greatest golden strike in history. He would form a group of wealthy merchants and provide the state with £1.2 million in cash, an astonishing sum for the time, roughly equivalent to $300 million today. But Paterson's genius was not in the number. It was hidden in the debt paradigm he proposed. He made the king an unthinkable offer. You will never have to repay this money. What sounded like a blessing was, in reality, one of the most insidious shackles in history. The government would never pay back the principal. In return, it would pay the bank 8% interest every year forever. And to manage this process, an entirely new private institution would be created, the Bank of England. Here lies the critical detail, and the reason why you work more and receive less every single day. These interest payments were guaranteed directly by the English Parliament, meaning by the taxes of the people. The state's power to tax was effectively mortgaged to the interest stream of a small group of bankers. As long as English citizens worked and paid taxes, that flow of interest would pour into the bankers' coffers. For the bankers, this was the purchase of a lifetime salary paid by the government. But Patterson's real strike came in the next step, darker even than the interest itself. The Bank of England was granted the authority to issue its own banknotes against this paper debt owed by the government. This is the true starting point of modern slavery, debt-based money creation. The bank lent the government paper it did not actually possess, money created out of nothing, while collecting interest paid with real taxes extracted from the people's labor. Patterson himself captured this chilling reality in a single sentence. The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. This was the moment when national debt ceased to be a crisis and became a way of life. The government borrowed, never repaid the principal, paid interest forever, and the debt itself circulated through the economy as money. When Parliament approved this plan in 1694, England's debt stopped being a problem and became the main engine of the system. You need to pause here and grasp the depth of this mathematical trap. If the state must borrow again to pay the interest on its existing debt, as it always does, the debt can never end, can only grow. When William Patterson died in 1719, he was not a very wealthy man, but the immortal debt machine he built is still running flawlessly today. In the 331 years since, the British national debt has never been fully repaid. It has only been restructured, rolled over, and expanded each time. Patterson had set the trap. Debt was no longer a choice. It had become the very breath the state needed to survive. Yet for this system to spread beyond England and evolve into an international weapon, a financial empire that would bind states in a global web, history's greatest manipulator still had to step onto the stage. At the dawn of the 19th century, on the fog-shrouded streets of London, another man would take this debt machine to a level that would hold all of Europe hostage. The early 1800s meant the smell of gunpowder, blood, and endless wars for Europe. As Napoleon Bonaparte redrew the map of the continent, governments desperately searched for cash just to survive. The model Patterson had created in 1694 had already seeped into the very cells of every royal court, yet the debt market was still fragmented and sluggish. Each loan required separate negotiations with bankers, and interest rates varied arbitrarily from country to country. Debt existed, but it had not yet become a global weapon capable of bringing the world to its knees. The man who ended this chaos and industrialized debt like a manufactured product was Nathan Rothschild. The Rothschild family had risen from the dark, narrow Jewish ghettos of Frankfurt to build a vast financial empire that spanned Europe's 5 strategic capitals: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, like a tightly woven web. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 1 purpose. This network was so powerful that Nathan's courier system and carrier pigeons delivered information faster than the official messengers of kings. Nathan was positioned at the heart of London, and his true revolution was transforming government debt into a product called bonds, something anyone could buy and sell on the stock exchange. Nathan's genius was this. Instead of lending directly to governments, he bought large quantities of government bonds at deep discounts, then distributed these debt instruments at higher prices through the vast investor network he had built. This was the exact birth of today's bond market and modern investment banking. The state received the cash it desperately needed immediately, and Rothschild pocketed the difference as commission. But the truly terrifying part was this. By anonymizing ownership of debt, Rothschild made it untouchable. When a government borrowed, its creditor was no longer a single individual, it was the market itself. The greatest and most insidious financial strike in history came in 1815, during the tense hours of the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18th, all of Europe's future was locked into that clash between Napoleon and Wellington. If Britain won, bonds would soar. If it lost, they would be worthless. Thanks to his legendary courier network, Nathan received news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before official channels. The moment he entered the London Stock Exchange, a meticulously scripted theater began. With an expression of deep sorrow, and in full view of everyone, he began panic selling all his British bonds. Other investors were terrified. If Nathan is selling, Britain has lost. The whisper spread like wildfire. Panic hit the market, prices collapsed, and as everyone dumped their papers for next to nothing, Nathan, through agents hidden in the shadows, bought everything. Every single bond. When news of victory arrived the next day, Nathan Rothschild was no longer just the richest man in the world. He was the largest and most powerful creditor of the British government. This was the moment the debt trap evolved. By making debt international and transferable, Rothschild turned default, the refusal to pay, into something almost impossible. A British bond could now be collateral for a French bank, which in turn backed a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. If a government said, "We won't pay," it was no longer defying a single bank. It was detonating the entire international financial system. Debt was no longer a burden on governments. It was a shackle that destroyed their freedom of movement. By the mid-1800s, Nathan Rothschild and his family were wealthier than kings. And there was only one source of that fortune: the interest on never-ending government debt. They produced nothing, laid not a single brick. They simply bound governments to themselves through interest. Patterson had built the engine of debt. Rothschild turned that engine into a spiderweb that enveloped the entire world. Yet this immense power was still in the hands of individuals, of a single family. For the system to become truly immortal, to cloak itself in official armor, this power had to be transferred to an institution hidden at the very heart of the state, an entity that appeared public but was, in essence, controlled by bankers. At the dawn of the 20th century, on the other side of the ocean, J.P. Morgan would connect the debt machine to that infinity engine that no one could ever stop. By the early 1900s, the United States had become the world's new rising star. Massive factories were being built, railroads stretched from coast to coast, and empires of oil and steel were taking shape. Yet the financial system of this economic giant was still trapped in the clumsy framework of the 18th century. The money supply was directly tied to gold, banks operated independently of one another, and most importantly, there was no central mechanism to control the system, to turn the tap on or off in times of crisis. For J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker of the era, this lack of control was unacceptable. Morgan did not merely want to manage the system. He wanted to transform it into an eternal machine that would run flawlessly in the banker's favor. The great financial panic of 1907 gave Morgan the opportunity he had been waiting for. Stock markets collapsed, the public stormed bank doors, and the economy ground to a halt. The government was helpless. Using his personal authority, J.P. Morgan summoned New York's most powerful bankers to the library of his private mansion. He locked the doors behind them and issued a blunt command: "You will not leave this room until you put the money on the table to save these banks." That day, Morgan was celebrated as the man who saved the system. But behind closed doors, he reached a darker conclusion. Debt and money management were far too critical to be left to the heroics of a single individual. The system needed to be stripped of personalities and encased in an official-looking fortress. There was, however, one seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The American public despised the dark central bank models of Europe. Previous attempts to establish a central bank had been shut down by public outrage, on the grounds that they handed too much power to bankers. So Morgan and his partners decided to make their plans not in the open, but in the deepest shadows. On a foggy November night in 1910, a group of men secretly met at a dark train station in New Jersey. They did not even address one another by name. Known only as the First Name Club, this group consisted of America's wealthiest bankers and most influential politicians. Their destination was a remote location off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. For 9 days on this isolated island, these men meticulously drafted every clause of what would become the Federal Reserve System, the true owner of the money in your pocket today. The brilliance of the plan was hidden in its language. They never called it a central bank, because that term triggered public fear of banker control. Instead, they named it the Federal Reserve. The name sounded like a government institution and suggested a kind of backup power. In reality, it was one of the greatest deceptions in history. The Fed was neither federal nor did it hold real reserves. It was a massive private cartel composed of 12 regional banks, whose shares were owned by the very bankers themselves. With this system, J.P. Morgan's legacy turned the debt trap into an infinity machine. Before the Fed, governments faced a physical limit to borrowing. Banks could only lend as much as the gold they held. The Fed erased that limit. The mechanism now worked with a devilish simplicity. When the government wanted to spend money, it issued bonds. The Fed bought those bonds with money that did not exist, money created out of nothing at that very moment. The government spent the money while the debt, with interest, was written onto the backs of the people and onto the Fed's balance sheet. At that moment, repaying debt became mathematically impossible, because every single dollar in circulation was created as debt, and with an obligation to pay interest. If all the world's debts were paid off today, not a single dollar would remain in the system. For the system to survive, more debt had to be created every year than the year before. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve Act was passed. He may not have lived to personally enjoy the fruits of this victory, but the invisible mechanism he built is the true force that has driven the American government toward a $38 trillion abyss today. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild globalized it. Morgan turned debt into money itself. Borrowing was no longer a choice. It became a requirement for the system's very existence. Yet one final piece was missing. A global enforcer had to take the stage, one that would prevent defaulters from escaping the system and turn debt into a tool of discipline. In the early 1980s, Paul Volcker would close the final link in the debt trap. By the late 1970s, The massive debt machine that Patterson had set in motion and Morgan had put on autopilot was choking on a monster of its own creation: inflation. Money was losing value so rapidly that, for lenders, the system was becoming unprofitable. Bankers were growing anxious because currency was melting away at an uncontrollable pace. The system faced two options: total collapse or the arrival of an iron hand that would turn debt into an instrument of discipline and punishment. That hand belonged to Paul Volcker, the towering 2-meter figure, rarely seen without a cheap cigar in his mouth, yet one of the most powerful financial executioners the world has ever known. When Volcker took control of the Federal Reserve in 1979, he had a single hidden agenda: to save the bankers' profit mechanism at all costs, namely the value of interest. He did this through one of the most ruthless economic maneuvers in history. Overnight, he drove interest rates up to nearly 20%. This was the harshest break the modern economy had ever experienced. It froze the blood flowing through the system's veins. Factories shut down across America, construction ground to a halt, unemployment exploded, and farmers drove their tractors to the doors of the Fed in protest. Volcker, however, calmly kept smoking his cigar, because his real target was not the American public, but the rewriting of the global rules of debt. The true tragedy unfolded on the other side of the ocean, among the victims known as the developing world. Throughout the 1970s, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and dozens of other developing countries had swallowed the bait of cheap and abundant dollars offered by Western banks. With a single decision by Volcker, they woke up trapped inside an impossible debt spiral. When dollar interest rates hit 20%, their debt burdens became mathematically unpayable overnight. Debt was no longer aid, it had become a firing squad. On August 12, 1982, the Mexican finance minister made that infamous phone call to Washington and uttered the sentence that changed the course of history: "It's over. We can't pay anymore." This should have been the moment for the system to cleanse itself, banks to fail, bad loans to be written off. But at that precise moment, Volcker closed the final link in the debt trap. Instead of allowing debts to be erased, he launched the largest hostage-taking operation in history through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The plan offered by Volcker and the IMF was not a rescue, it was a contract of permanent dependency. Countries were not promised debt forgiveness. Instead, they were given new loans so they could continue paying interest on their old debts to Western banks. The price was the surrender of economic sovereignty. Under so-called structural adjustment programs, nations were forced to sell their factories, slash social spending, cut education for their children, and devote all remaining resources solely to interest payments. This was Volcker's legacy. Debt was no longer just about money. It became a global whip, one that ruled states, toppled governments, and forced entire nations to kneel at the doors of bankers. Volcker sealed the exit forever for those who could not pay. Debtors were no longer free. Their debts were merely restructured, and every restructuring meant deeper servitude. The story that began in 1694 was now complete. Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker, these four men may have lived in different centuries and been known by different names, but together they assembled the pieces of a single dark purpose. One made debt permanent. Another turned it into a global weapon. Another transformed debt into money itself. And the last built the system of guardianship that made escape from that debt impossible. Now look again at the massive picture we live with today: $315 trillion in global debt. This number is not a mistake, nor is it a crisis. It is the fuel of the largest, most persistent, and most invisible transfer of wealth in human history. Every day you go to work, every time you pay taxes, every time you wonder why prices at the grocery store keep rising, you are in fact paying rent to that colossal machine these four men built centuries ago. The truth is this debt will never be paid off. Because here lies the darkest secret of the system. If all the world's debt were fully repaid today, the money supply would collapse. Since dollars and other currencies are created through borrowing, when the debt disappears, the money disappears with it. That would mean a global depression, the freezing of trade, and the paralysis of civilization itself. This is why debt cannot be eliminated. It is structural. It is the cornerstone of the design. Today, the U.S. government carries $38 trillion in debt, and the interest on that debt alone approaches $1 trillion per year. Whose pocket does that money come out of? Yours. These trillions collected from taxpayers flow directly into the hands of the institutional holders of that debt, gigantic financial entities. Structures like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street manage trillions and extract enormous wealth even from government interest payments alone. This is a permanent, systematic transfer of wealth from labor to capital, repeated year after year. For men, 3 centuries. One outcome: a world order in which governments borrow forever and populations pay interest forever. You cannot escape this system because the system itself is built on top of you. At school, you were taught that debt is a problem that must be solved. But now you know the truth. Debt is not a problem. It is the foundation of the system. And the interest you pay is the price of living inside this financial prison. $38 trillion is not an accident. It is an engineering masterpiece planned centuries ago. And exactly as those men foresaw, as long as people continue to believe that the state will pay this interest, and that money itself has value, the game will go on forever. Once you see the invisible chains of the modern world, nothing will ever look the same again. When you wake up every morning, are you starting your day to pay down a debt? Or simply to keep an endless interest while turning? More importantly, what kind of legacy will you leave to the next generation? A future of freedom, or a sealed promissory note of debt? The choice is yours, assuming you still believe you have one.